Hello, and welcome back to part two of our overview of the Middle Ages, which we're using as a preview of the road to the Renaissance. In the last video, we had looked at the development of feudalism and the influence of the Catholic Church in Western Europe during the so-called Dark Ages, the first half of the Middle Ages. During the second half of the Middle Ages, which we're going to consider from about 1000 AD to about 1500 AD, and again, keep in mind that this is approximate, you're going to see a number of steps taken by medieval civilization that's going to get them closer to what we think of as the modern world and getting ready for a rebirth, if you would, of advanced civilization. The first thing we're going to look at is the list of events or changes that we're going to look at here. We're going to start by talking a little bit about something called the Crusades. From there, we look at their impact on life in medieval towns. We'll also talk about one of the most significant documents in all of history, let alone Middle Ages history, the Magna Carta. And we'll wrap up with a look at the Black Death, which was a game changer for a lot of people in a lot of ways. Start you off in 1096. As you'll see from the map, this may remind you that Christianity had dominated most of Europe during the so-called Dark Ages, with the exception of Spain. Spain had been under Muslim control since the mid 700s. Islam had also come to dominate in the Middle East, including the Holy Land and specifically the city of Jerusalem. In 1096, Pope Urban II rounded up a number of Christian knights and Christian kings and got them to march across Europe into the Middle East to fight the first of what became known as the Crusades, literally Wars of the Cross. The main issue or cause of the Crusades was control of the Holy Land, specifically the city of Jerusalem. The Crusaders wanted to keep it under Christian control. The Muslims obviously wanted to keep it under their control as well. The Crusades went on for several hundred years. Ultimately, not much of anything was settled. Ultimately, the Holy Land remained pretty much under Muslim control for the rest of that time. However, the constant travel back and forth between Western Europe and the Middle East created a number of trade routes. Commerce began to be introduced, and this is going to have a profound impact on Europe as well. This takes us to our second big change, and that is town life. As commerce and trade becomes more important, people start to move to towns and cities because they're natural centers for trade. Think of the way that grocery stores or shopping malls work. What makes them important or significant is that you're able to get a lot of things done in one place. That's the advantage of cities since the beginning of civilization. And you see these start to develop during the later Middle Ages. Along with the town came a couple of other great changes. One was the idea of social mobility. In the old feudal society that you might remember from the first screencast, the class you were born in was the class you were going to stay in. There was no chance to move up. The system was designed to be that way to keep itself stable. However, in the town, because your position often depended upon, let's say, your talent, your training, your skill, and in some cases luck, you actually had a chance to move up. Perhaps you couldn't be a noble, you still had to be born into the nobility, but through talent and luck, you could actually make yourself wealthy. So even if you didn't have the title or the land, you could still command great wealth and therefore great power and respect. This results in the creation of a whole new class of people known as the bourgeoisie. That's a word you'll hear a lot this year. It literally means people of the town. Think of Pittsburgh or Foxborough, words that mean town. In this case, the bourgeoisie were kind of a middle class made up of merchants, people who bought and sold and traded goods for a living, bankers. With trade becoming more important, money also became more important. If merchants trade, buy, and sell goods, bankers effectively buy, trade, and sell the use of money. The third group that became part of this new bourgeoisie were artisans or craftsmen. Think people like cobblers, blacksmiths, carpenters, and the like. Why middle class? Well, remember, nobility was something you were born into. So even though these folks might command a great deal of respect and power in the town, they were not of noble birth necessarily, and therefore they couldn't be upper class. However, because they had a skill and because they had wealth, you couldn't exactly plant them in with the peasants or serfs either. So they don't have the birthright to be upper, but they've got too much money or skill to be lower. Where do you put them? Smack in the middle. And you'll find that by regulating trade through guilds, these bourgeoisie maintained a tremendous amount of power and wealth, which they're going to use to fuel the Renaissance later on, as you'll see. Our third big change occurs in the year 1215 with something called Magna Carta. At this time, national monarchies like France, Spain, and England were getting more and more powerful. One of these was England's King John, who got into a little bit of a scrap over taxes with his barons. And in 1215, they sat John down and forced him to sign something called the Magna Carta, or Great Charter. This is one of the most significant documents in history by establishing three essential ideas. First, even kings have to follow the law. You may remember from our first screencast that kings often received the support of the Catholic Church, meaning they were as good as gods on earth. However, Magna Carta states that kings might be divine, but they're still responsible to follow the law. The Magna Carta also is one of the first documents to list people's individual rights. This is important because once it's down on paper, it never really goes away. And this is going to be the inspiration for a later English Bill of Rights in the 1600s, and eventually an inspiration for the American Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and Bill of Rights itself. Third, the Magna Carta establishes the notion that taxation has to be fair. You may remember from American studies, no taxation without representation. Well, where do you think the colonists got that idea from? Chances are it was from what they knew about the Magna Carta back in 1215. So, a significant change, putting more authority into the hands of the people and opening up the idea of different possibilities for what governments can do. Our last change is not so interesting or significant, at least in terms of advancing civilization. In fact, this development very nearly ground civilization to a halt. The Black Death or bubonic plague hit Europe in the 1340s. The Black Death is a bacterial disease, um, specifically carried a lot by fleas and other parasitic insects. It was transmitted, uh, believed to be transmitted by rats who carried the bacteria in their bloodstreams, and when fleas bit the rats and drank their blood, the bacteria would multiply, and when the rat died, the flea would jump off the rat and perhaps eventually jump onto a human, and when they bit the human, that infected blood was transferred to the human. So how was the Black Death introduced into Europe? More than likely through shipping and trade from Central Asia. Once it hit like wildfire. The symptoms for the disease are pretty gross, and you can see this wax figure here simulating a lot of what they were. It usually began with the formation of boils at the nodes. In other words, places where one part of the body joins another. For example, the neck was a common spot for the boils. You can see one here, uh, right at the armpit, the groin, any place where body parts join together. You would see these boils that dripped pus and blood. Yeah, it's gross, I know. And then eventually they would turn black with blood, and they were called buboes or bubos, and that's where the word bubonic plague comes from. Along with the buboes, the victim would often find themselves with fever, shortness of breath, upset stomach, diarrhea, and usually within a week, uh, the plague would claim another victim. As we said, it spread rapidly across Europe, and in the space of about 5 years, put this in perspective now, in about 5 years, and again, the estimates aren't clear because records just weren't kept the same way back then, but most estimates have it somewhere between 20 and 25 million people killed out of a population that may have been as low as 50 to 60 million. I've seen estimates that range from 1/4 of Europe's population to 1/2 of Europe's population. We'll split the difference here and say 1/3. Even so, 1 out of 3 people succumbing to the disease is pretty significant. It brings about a lot of changes. For example, because the plague hits so many of the working class, the number of workers available for jobs actually goes down. And in a sad way, it actually makes working people more valuable, and therefore their wages are going to go up for a time. It also serves to illustrate the differences between the working class and the upper classes. Many of the wealthy and rich were able to barricade themselves in castles or move to summer chateaus far away from the cities where the plague was spreading. Those who had to stay behind and be the essential workers in the city, so to speak, weren't quite as lucky. It also created questions regarding the influence of the church. As with most things, people looked to the church for guidance, advice, and assistance during this crisis. And because nothing the church did seemed to be able to stop the disease, people began to question the infallibility and the authority of the church. They also began to question the perhaps supernatural nature of this disease. Um, Lacking scientific knowledge, they attributed the disease to anything from a passing comet to an infected cloud to poisoned drinking water, and they tried everything from powdered gold to stag's horns and even rubbed live frogs on the boils. Obviously, they didn't have much of a clue as to what goes on with the disease. So, in addition to the questioning of the church's influence, people also began to ask questions that would lead to scientific inquiry and scientific and medical experimentation. So, in a lot of ways, the Black Death Although a humanitarian crisis of the first order did kind of set the stage for moving out of crisis mode and looking for something new and something different. And that's going to be the Renaissance, which we're setting up as part of our next unit.